Caleb Vance was 17 years old and carried his death around in a rolling plastic tank. It wasn't the most poetic way to exist, but the Arctic Air portable oxygen concentrator was the only thing keeping his lungs from collapsing under the weight of the fluid that his body insisted on producing. He lived in a quiet, rain-slicked suburb of Portland, a place where the gray sky felt like a heavy wool blanket. His mother, a woman whose entire personality had been subsumed by the role of caregiver, insisted that Caleb was depressed. She pushed him to attend a support group held in the basement of a local Lutheran church, a room decorated with beige folding chairs and a rug that smelled like damp cardboard and forgotten prayers. The group was led by Marcus, a man in his 30s who had lost both legs to a rare bone cancer and now spent his days encouraging teenagers to live in the heart of the storm. It was a miserable gathering of the dying, until the day Julian Reed walked in. Julian didn't look like he belonged in a basement full of shadows. He was lean, with messy dark hair and a crooked grin that seemed to challenge the very concept of tragedy. He was there to support their mutual friend, Isaac, who was preparing to lose his sight to a recurring retinoblastoma. During the sharing circle, Julian didn't take his eyes off Caleb. When Marcus asked Julian to share his fears, Julian didn't talk about pain or hospitals. He talked about oblivion, the fear that one day, everyone who ever lived would be forgotten, and all human achievement would be reduced to dust. Caleb, usually the quietest person in the room, couldn't help himself. He countered with the cold reality that the sun would eventually swallow the earth anyway, so worrying about a legacy was a waste of the limited breath he had left. Julian didn't look offended. He looked delighted. After the meeting, Julian approached him, leaning against a brick wall with an unlit cigarette dangling from his lips. Caleb was horrified, pointing out that smoking was essentially paying a corporation to kill you faster. Julian just laughed, explaining that it was a metaphor. You put the killing thing right between your teeth, but you never give it the power to do its killing. In the weeks that followed, the two became inseparable. Julian had lost a leg to osteosarcoma a year prior but was currently in remission, a clean boy, as he put it. He treated Caleb not as a patient, but as a person with a sharp mind and a biting wit. They swapped favorite books. Caleb gave Julian The Sovereign Sorrow, a dense, philosophical novel about a girl with cancer that ended mid-sentence. For Caleb, the book was the only thing that felt honest about the great unknown. It didn't offer a happy ending. It just stopped, mirroring the way life actually ends. Julian became obsessed with the book's lack of resolution, particularly the fate of the protagonist's mother and her pet hamster. He decided they needed answers from the reclusive author, Peter Van Houten, who lived in self-imposed exile in Amsterdam. Julian used his wish, a gift from a foundation for terminal children, to fly them both, along with Caleb's mother, to the Netherlands. The trip was a gamble. Caleb's health was precarious. A week before they were set to leave, his lungs filled with fluid, landing him in the ICU. He woke up to the sound of machines and the sight of Julian sitting by his bed, refusing to leave. Despite the doctor's warnings, Caleb's mother saw the light in her son's eyes when he looked at Julian and agreed to the journey. They flew across the Atlantic, Caleb hooked to his machine, feeling the terrifying, beautiful weight of being alive in a world that was wider than a hospital room. Amsterdam was a city of canals and narrow houses, a place that felt like it had been built to be painted. On their first night, Julian and Caleb went to a high-end restaurant called Orangey, where they drank champagne that tasted like bottled stars. It was a night of pure, unadulterated magic. Julian confessed his love, not with the desperation of someone running out of time, but with the calm certainty of someone who had finally found what he was looking for. Caleb, who had spent years trying to be a grenade that would minimize the damage when he finally blew up, realized he couldn't stop Julian from loving him, and he didn't want to anymore. The meeting with Peter Van Houten, however, was a disaster. The man was a bloated, bitter alcoholic who listened to loud electronic music and sneered at their questions. He told them that characters in books don't have lives after the final page is turned. They simply cease to exist. He insulted Caleb's medical condition and mocked their quest for meaning. They left his house in tears, the dream of closure shattered. To salvage the day, Van Houten's assistant, Leidwich, took them to the Anne Frank house. Climbing the steep, narrow stairs was an agonizing physical struggle for Caleb, his lungs burning with every step. But standing in the attic where a girl had once hidden from a different kind of death, Caleb felt a profound connection to the endurance of the human spirit. In that cramped, hallowed space, he and Julian shared their first real kiss, a moment of defiance against the silence that was waiting for them both. The joy of the trip was short-lived. On their last day in Amsterdam, Julian sat Caleb down on a bench overlooking a canal and told him the truth. While Caleb had been in the ICU, Julian had gone in for a routine PET scan. The results showed that his cancer had returned with a vengeance. He was lit up like a Christmas tree. The boy who had seemed so invincible, the one who was supposed to survive and remember Caleb, was now the one who was fading. The return to Portland was a descent into a different kind of darkness. Julian's health deteriorated with terrifying speed. The witty, athletic boy was replaced by someone who was often confused, in pain, and humiliated by his body's betrayal. One night, Julian called Caleb from a gas station, his voice small and terrified. He had tried to buy a pack of cigarettes, the metaphor he couldn't quite finish, and his prosthetic leg had failed him. Caleb found him covered in his own sickness, clutching the steering wheel, crying because he just wanted to be more than his disease. It was the hardest moment of Caleb's life, seeing the boy he loved reduced to the very thing they both feared, a tragedy. A few days later, Julian arranged a pre-funeral in the church basement. He wanted to hear his eulogies while he was still around to appreciate the prose. Isaac, now completely blind, gave a speech that was both funny and heartbreaking. Then Caleb stood up. He didn't talk about Julian's courage or his looks. He talked about the concept of infinity. He explained that some infinities are bigger than others, that the space between 0 and 1 is infinite, but the space between 0 and 2 is even larger. He thanked Julian for their little infinity, a span of time that was far too short, but had contained an entire lifetime of meaning. Julian died 8 days later in the hospital. The grief was a physical weight on Caleb, heavier than any oxygen tank. At the funeral, he was shocked to see Peter Van Houten in the pews. The author had traveled from Amsterdam, claiming that Julian had written to him before he died, demanding that Van Houten make amends for his behavior. Van Houten tried to explain that the sovereign sorrow was based on his own daughter who had died of cancer, which was why he was so broken and cruel. Caleb didn't want his apologies. He just wanted Julian back. He sent the old man away, realizing that he didn't need Van Houten to tell him what happened to the characters in the book. He knew what happened. Life went on until it didn't, and the people left behind had to find a way to carry the memory. In the days following the funeral, Caleb learned from Isaac that Julian had been working on something in his final weeks. He had been writing a response to Van Houten, a sort of coda to their shared story. Caleb searched everywhere, eventually realizing that Julian hadn't sent a letter to him, but to Van Houten himself, asking the author to write a eulogy for Caleb. Through Leidwich, Caleb received the text of that letter. It wasn't a eulogy for Caleb's death, but a celebration of his life. Julian wrote about how Caleb was beautiful, how he was a person who chooses to be known, and how he had no regrets about loving him. The letter ended with Julian's reflections on the world. He wrote that we don't get to choose if we get hurt in this world, but we do have some say in who hurts us. He was happy with his choice. The final words of the letter were a question to Caleb. I like my choices. I hope you like yours, Caleb Vance. Caleb sat in his room, the rain tapping against the window of his Portland home, his oxygen machine humming its steady, mechanical rhythm. He thought about the boy with the unlit cigarette and the crooked smile, the boy who had taught him that even a short life could be a masterpiece. He looked out at the gray sky and whispered his answer to the empty air. I do, Julian, he said. I do. The silence that followed wasn't the cold, empty oblivion Julian had feared. It was a full silence, a quiet space held open by the love they had shared. Caleb knew his own clock was ticking, that his lungs were tired and his time was winding down. But he wasn't a grenade anymore. He was a story, one that had been read and cherished by someone who truly understood the text. He didn't need to know what happened after the book ended, because he understood now that the ending wasn't the point. The point was the little infinity they had built together, a space that existed outside of time, where two broken boys had found a way to be whole. He closed his eyes, feeling the air move through his tubes, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of the next page. The story of Caleb Vance and Julian Reed did not end at the grave, nor did it end with a letter. It lived on in the quiet, agonizing stretches of time that Caleb had to fill with his own fading breath. In the weeks following the funeral, Portland felt smaller, its rain more suffocating. Caleb's mother began the slow, heartbreaking process of normalizing, which mostly involved suggesting he rejoin the world. But Caleb wasn't interested in the world. He was interested in the architecture of the void Julian had left behind. He spent hours in his room, the oxygen concentrator clicking like a metronome, staring at the ceiling and trying to remember the exact shade of blue in Julian's eyes when he was laughing. Isaac, now navigating a world of permanent shadows, became Caleb's tether. They would sit in Isaac's backyard, the air smelling of damp cedar and earth. Isaac was learning to live without sight, but he was also learning to live without Julian's constant, irreverent commentary. They talked about the great beyond not as a religious concept, but as a physical place they were both approaching at different speeds. Isaac confessed that he sometimes forgot what Julian looked like, and the guilt of it was a sharper pain than the cancer had ever been. Caleb, in turn, described Julian's face in obsessive detail, the way his jaw set when he was being stubborn, the slight scar near his hairline, preserving the image in words so it wouldn't dissolve into the ether. One afternoon, a package arrived from Amsterdam. It wasn't from the bitter Peter Van Houten, but from Leidwidge, his former assistant who had quit in a fit of righteous indignation after their disastrous visit. Inside was a collection of loose-leaf papers, original notes, and deleted scenes from The Sovereign Sorrow. Leidwidge wrote that she couldn't stand the thought of the story being locked away in a drunkard's desk. As Caleb read through the fragments, he realized that the book's protagonist, Anna, wasn't just a character. She was a vessel for everything Van Houten had loved and lost. But more importantly, Caleb found a discarded ending where Anna's mother joined a support group for parents who had lost children. It was a small, quiet detail, but it gave Caleb something he hadn't known he needed: the assurance that the people left behind would eventually find a way to eat breakfast again. Caleb's own health began to decline more rapidly in the autumn. The fluid in his lungs became a constant tide, and the hospital visits turned from monthly to weekly. He was no longer the boy who went to the park. He was the boy who watched the park from a window. His world shrank to the size of his bed, but his mind remained expansive. He started writing, not a novel, but a series of reflections on the metaphor of the cigarette. He wrote about how everyone has something they hold between their teeth: fear, grief, regret, and how the trick was to keep it there without letting it catch fire. He wrote for Julian, but he also wrote for himself, trying to map out the geography of a life that was measured in quality rather than quantity. His mother, sensing the end was near, stopped trying to make him well and started trying to make him comfortable. They watched old movies together, the kind where the endings were happy and the music was swell. She never mentioned the grenade anymore. She just held his hand, her thumb tracing the blue veins beneath his paper-thin skin. One night, as the wind rattled the window panes, Caleb asked her what she would do when he was gone. She didn't cry. She told him she would keep living because that was the only way to honor the fact that he had lived at all. She told him she was proud of the man he had become, even if he had only had 18 years to become him. In his final days, Caleb had a vivid dream. He was back in Amsterdam, standing on a bridge over a canal at twilight. The water was still, reflecting the golden lights of the city. Julian was there, leaning against the railing, his prosthetic leg looking brand new and his smile as crooked as ever. He wasn't sick, and Caleb wasn't carrying a tank. They were just two boys in a beautiful city, with nowhere to be and all the time in the world. Julian reached out and handed him a book, a finished version of The Sovereign Sorrow. When Caleb opened it, the pages were blank. "You have to finish it, Caleb," Julian said, his voice echoing against the brick walls. "The story isn't done until you say it is." Caleb woke up to the gray Portland dawn, the taste of the dream still on his tongue. He felt a strange sense of peace, a lightness that had nothing to do with his lungs. He realized that the little infinity Julian had given him wasn't a closed loop. It was a foundation. He had been so worried about being forgotten, about the oblivion Julian feared, but he understood now that memory wasn't about statues or history books. It was about the way a person's existence changed the trajectory of someone else's life. He had been changed by Julian, and Isaac had been changed by both of them. The ripple effect was infinite, even if the pebble was small. He spent his last conscious hours with Isaac, listening to a record Julian had loved, a scratchy indie folk album that sounded like nostalgia. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The music filled the gaps where words were too heavy. Caleb felt the tide in his lungs rising for the last time, but he didn't struggle against it. He thought about the stars, the ones that had died millions of years ago but whose light was only just reaching the earth. He was like that light, he realized. He might be gone, but the glow of his life would keep traveling, hitting the eyes of the people he loved long after he was out of sight. As the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across his room, Caleb closed his eyes. He wasn't thinking about the pain or the hospital or the unfairness of it all. He was thinking about a metaphor. He was thinking about a boy with an unlit cigarette, standing in a church basement, looking at him like he was the only person in the world who mattered. He was thinking about the way the champagne tasted like stars and the way the wind felt on a bridge in Amsterdam. He was thinking about the fact that he had been loved, and that he had loved in return, and that in the grand, terrifying history of the universe that was more than enough. The final page of Caleb Vance's story didn't end mid-sentence. It ended with a period, a firm, quiet conclusion to a life that had been lived with ferocious intensity. His mother found him later that evening, looking peaceful in the fading light. There were no more machines humming, no more clicking of the oxygen tank. Just the silence of a Portland night and the smell of rain on the pavement. She sat by his side for a long time, not as a caregiver, but as a mother who had finished her work. She picked up the notebook beside his bed, the one filled with his thoughts on metaphors and infinities, and she began to read. Years later, Isaac would tell people about the two boys who had taught him how to see in the dark. He would talk about Caleb's wit and Julian's smile, and how they had found a way to be grander than their circumstances. He would tell them that life is a series of choices, and that the best choice you can make is to let someone know you, truly and deeply, even if it hurts. because the hurt is just proof that the love was real. And in the end, the light from those distant, vanished stars is the only thing that truly guides us home. Caleb Vance was gone, but his little infinity remained, a bright, unshakable point in the darkness, reminding anyone who looked up that they were not alone.